You've probably come up against the religions. I mean, the Jewish people are identified with circumcision, and then Muslims perhaps a lesser extent, and Christians again, but to a lesser extent. Are you making any progress on the religious side?
The key with religious groups is to collaborate, and there is progress. In America, there's a rising of a small percentage of Jewish people of Jewish faith that are not cutting their children anymore. Instead of doing the eighth-day covenant cutting, known as Brit Milah, they're doing the eighth-day covenant known as Brit Shalom, which instead of cutting the child, they cut a flower and welcome the child into the Jewish faith. And also in Israel, there's a small percentage of parents now not cutting their children. So we're hoping that arising will now spread to Australia.
Because it's well accepted that circumcision is illegal for women in Australia, and yet the practice, I understand, still goes on in Africa, in some parts of Africa. Um, the message must have got out about women, but not for boys for some reason.
Absolutely, it's a great point. And Australia's closest nation, Indonesia, they cut all of Muslim women. In other words, 90% of women in Indonesia are cut. And this is something that in Australia, for example, and in the West, we would typically recognise as abhorrent and wrong. Yet, just over the shore in sunny Australia, we're cutting our boys. And we can't see the dissonance there. And I think it's a really important point you raise. Cutting any child for one's cultural predilections, whether they're dressed up as medicine or however, is breaching that individual's consent. It's also engaging in an irreversible amputation on a non-consenting person. And in that sense, FGM and male genital cutting are exactly the same in that they're breaching consent of an individual engaging in an irreversible amputation. Now, people sometimes argue, but I think on the females they cut more off and it does more damage. It's sometimes worse and sometimes not as bad. There's all different types of female cutting. Male circumcision, sometimes because they're removing half the penile skin, sometimes that's actually more. Like if you go to Indonesia or Malaysia, often they're doing FGM4 where they're removing a lot less tissue. Sometimes in Malaysia, they're just doing a pinprick nick to draw some blood. They're not actually removing any tissue. Yet in the West, we still hold to this view that they're cutting the whole clitoris off, which actually only happens in 8% of cases, as per World Health Organization data. That's mainly around the Horn of Africa, Somalia, and Sudan. But yet that's the image, that 8% is the image that the whole West have, infibulation, cutting off the whole clitoris and sewing it up, when in actual fact there's a huge variation in cutting practices on women, all of which are wrong and reprehensible, which Foreskin Revolution oppose. And we're really glad in Australia that the authorities work with immigrant families to try and help them see the value of not cutting their girls, which is great news. Australia are really ahead of the curve there. We just wish the Australian authorities would come on board with our baby boys as well, because they're cutting off half of the penile tissue, and that contains the majority of the pleasurable nerve endings. And that means these boys are growing up never knowing what the natural penis looked or felt like, unaware. So they're missing out on the ridge band, the frenulum, all the mycins corpuscles, the rich, ticklish, highly innovative nerve endings, of which there are thousands amongst the foreskin. They're missing out on the gliding mechanism. If you imagine pulling your long sleeve across your arm and your hand, and then gliding it back and forth, that's what the gliding mechanism's like. It's this amazing feat of engineering by nature on the body that creates a wonderful gliding mechanism, enhancing pleasure and lubrication for both partners, plus the foreskin's nerve ending rich, increasing pleasure.
Now, you mentioned FGM there a few times. I think that must refer to female genital mutilation. Is that right?
That's correct.
If only we recognise it for young boys. It is also genital mutilation, but that perhaps might be a start to doing something about it.